You're listening to All Things 3D, where we talk about the world of fabricating, designing, and capturing in the third dimension.
Hi, this is Mike Balzer of All Things 3D, and today we're going to talk about a topic that I've mentioned a few times on the show, and that's gun violence, in particular about the mass killers behind them. And today we have a special guest, Shavaun Scot, who's a psychotherapist with forensic specialties, who's coming out with a new book called The Minds of Mass Killers, Understanding and Interrupting the Pathway to Violence. That'll be published by McFarland Books. And you can find out more about it at pshavaunscot.com. So before we get started, let me introduce her. This is Shavaun Scot. Why don't you kind of talk about yourself a little bit, where you're from, what you do for a living, and then I've got a few questions for you.
Alrighty. I'm a psychotherapist in private practice in both California and Oregon. I presently live in Portland. And I've been in practice since 1991, most of that time in private practice. But I've also spent time working as a team member on multidisciplinary treatment teams in specialty forensic programs with the criminally insane and people who have committed very violent crimes. So I have a particular interest in violence prevention. Seems like most of the people I've helped with all sorts of problems over the last 30 years have been either victims or perpetrators of violence, and often both. So I'm passionately interested in the topic.
Wow. Sounds like you've got a pretty deep history there. Okay. So, one of the main questions obviously is going to be, what is a mass killer? Is there a definition out there, or can you add more to that?
Yeah. There are a lot of definitions, and many of them try to define it based upon how many people were killed. But in fact, that's a very poor way to define it, because sometimes the marksmanship of a killer is very poor. And so not that many people, or maybe no one, was killed. However, the intention of the crime was the same. So, for my purposes, in understanding the thinking and the motivations of a mass killer, I'm defining it as anytime there's a rampage attack in a public place by one or more perpetrators, generally targeting a variety of people, often unknown to the killer, personally unknown to them, often targeted for symbolic reasons, but not a personal reason. And it's not in the commission of a crime or gang violence or something with that kind of motivation. So a killing in a public place with the intent to kill as many people as possible. So whether the person succeeds or whether they don't succeed, it's in the same category of what I'm examining.
Interesting. So on this topic of mass killers, it appears that your book mainly talks about those mass killers in the United States. Is there a reason for that?
Well, the United States has sort of been the genesis for the phenomenon in modern times. Although we are seeing an increase in mass killings in other countries that are sort of following the model of the United States. So, in fact, in looking at these issues in the book, I cover mass killers from all over the world, but the bulk of them do happen in the US.
So have you personally encountered a mass killer?
I have worked with quite a few clients who have murdered people, and I can't talk really specifically about anyone that I've
Of
worked with.
course.
But yes, people who have killed multiple people.
So you got some first-hand experience actually talking with it. That must be kind of
Hmm.
creepy a little bit, huh?
You get used to it.
I don't know if I'd ever get used to it. Okay, so as mentioned, you've encountered them. Now, we also know that politicians like to use the word senseless mass killing or senseless killing. You make a point of identifying that actually the actions of these mass killers are purposeful. You want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, that's one of the myths that really makes me crazy, because what may appear senseless to everyday normal people, people like you and me. It seems to make no sense, but it always makes sense from the perspective of the killer. And if you understand the motives and the rationales that are given, it's very purposeful and it makes perfect sense depending on whose eyes you're looking through. So, from the perspective of the general public, it's senseless, but it's not senseless at all. And if we don't understand the thinking of the mass killer, we can't do anything to prevent this or to stop it from happening.
You also identify that some of the survivors have actually been through more than one mass killing event. That just I can't wrap my hands around. I think I saw it in the news that somebody had been part of the Las Vegas and then was at another one. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more of that. That just seems like a new phenomena.
Yeah, one of the, there are a lot of trends that if you follow the research data, it's very clear that mass killings are increasing in frequency. They're more deadly, so more people are being murdered in these events. And they're moving out of what traditionally we talked about school shooters or, people going postal in the post office or whatever. Things are moving out from that. So we've had incidents at Walmart, in grocery stores, in bars and nightclubs, in churches. It's really impacting us in a very dramatic way. Even if none of us are ever exposed directly, we're all exposed indirectly because of the increasing intensity and frequency and the broadening of the location of these events.
Yeah, that's kind of sad. So let's see. Now this is an interesting. You use the word uh, steps on the pathway. What does that mean exactly?
Well, another myth that we hear very often is that the person just snapped. There's actually a very well documented and exhaustively studied pathway that leads to these events. And it starts with grievances, it moves to fantasy, to planning, and then into the actual breach and attack. And these phases go on for weeks, months, and sometimes even years. And we can track in each of these cases the pathway that the person went on. And so, of course, when we're looking at stopping these events from occurring, we want to interrupt the pathway, and ideally to interrupt the pathway as early on as we can, ideally before a person ever picks up a weapon or even gets a weapon.
Yeah, you would hope. So in your book, you kind of identify that there are two types, or not even two types, but there are differences from people who are considered mentally ill and those with personality disorders. I'm a little confused on what that means, and I probably am not the only one. So maybe you can kind of give us a little bit more detail, and obviously in the book, you go into a lot more detail.
Right. Well, one of the other horrendous myths that I spend a great deal of time discussing in the book is that mass killers are all mentally ill. And, we can kind of get into a definitional quagmire when we try to say, what is mental illness? These people must be crazy to do these awful things. Well, again, just because it doesn't make sense to us doesn't mean that they're mentally ill, officially mentally ill. And by that, I mean, are they having delusions or hallucinations, some kind of a severe biological impairment in their brain that's causing them to not understand what they're doing or to not be rational? In truth, only 10% of those who commit mass killings have a major mental illness. So that's significant, but it's certainly not the predominant number. Um, More of them have what we found to be a cluster of personality traits. Now, they may not always meet official definition for a personality disorder, but there's a cluster of traits that seem to go with these folks. And those three traits that they cluster under narcissism, which is the desire for fame and infamy, fame at any cost, psychopathy, which is the callous, no conscience, manipulative qualities, and then paranoia. And that is the tendency in this case to blame other people for one's problems. So if it's a minority group, if it's immigrants, if it's women, if it's gay people, it's this projection that because I'm miserable and I have got, all these things that aren't working out in my life, it's the fault of this other group. And that's the group that becomes the target. So when you find the narcissism, the psychopathy, the paranoia all together, that's kind of a perfect storm. And when you combine other social and cultural factors with that, that's why we see what is happening.
Well, I also noticed that a number, in fact, I would say all of them in recent history seem to be men. Why aren't there any women killing lots of people?
There have been maybe 2 incidents out of hundreds where women did make attempts at mass killing. It's certainly not the norm, but we can go back to why are 90% of people incarcerated for violent crime male? I mean, that's an hour discussion in and of itself. But we can just summarize by saying, yes, they do tend to be male.
Yes, I noticed that. So you alluded in the previous, not this previous question, but the one before it, about cultural and social issues or factors that play an important role in the planning and the, what do you want to call it, the behind the scene on these mass killings. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, there's a lot, and I do go into those a lot in the book. But just as a brief summary, one of the areas that is very well documented is, what we often call toxic masculinity, or the idea that to be a real man, you're powerful through violence, and particularly through weapons and through some kind of destruction. The action movie hero or the veneration of the bad guy anti-hero that we see so often in popular culture. That's certainly one factor. Another factor is the internet, because a lot of the folks with this personality constellation that I described connect online now. And when they connect online, it becomes this reinforcing loop where they talk to each other over and over and over. And they actually build a sense of camaraderie and community through hate and through this often veneration of other mass killers. And so when you combine the toxic masculinity along with the online cultures, that people that perhaps previously would never meet another person exactly like themselves. And so it did not magnify the way it's magnifying now because of the online, the way people cluster. So when you combine all these different factors, and then of course the other thing that's rather uniquely American is the availability of guns, particularly military grade semi-automatic firearms, that are ubiquitous here. We have more guns than people in the United States. And so it really does all together create the perfect storm. In addition to the media, which has given tremendous uh, time to attention to people who are seeking fame. And that again builds this kind of cultural template that we're seeing here, which is why we're seeing so much of the increase.
You made a point several times of mentioning media. What does social media in particular, I think you have an entire chapter on it. How has that changed things?
Well, one of the horrifying things that's also been happening are people live streaming as they're doing the mass killings, um, literally posting to Facebook in the middle of the rampage. So the ability to get attention and to become famous worldwide immediately is very appealing to the narcissistic sociopath with sadistic features, which is what we can say a lot of these guys are. So social media, in essence, feeds it. It's also where we see a lot of leakage. Leakage is the term for when people foreshadow what they're thinking about. And often the leakage goes on for a long time before anybody actually acts. And when people are reviewing later on, like social media posts or YouTube posts, where people have said, I'm going to be the next school shooter. There have literally been people who posted videos saying that. And other people saw the videos and they said, well, we thought he was just joking, or we didn't think he'd really do it. And then conversely, sometimes they say, oh, I always thought he would do it. So that's one of the big messages of my book. We call it, if you see something, say something. And if you see alarming trends that someone is posting on social media, if they're affiliating with hate groups, if they're attacking people of other races, genders, cultures, blaming immigrants for things, if they seem very angry, if they're perseverating on violence or talking about it over and over and over, posing with weapons, um, pretending to make jokes about things, or if you see people in online groups, it's really important to report. And I suggest
Yeah.
reporting to your local law
Is that the same
enforcement.
thing as red flags?
Yeah, those
Okay.
those could all be considered red flags. There are a lot of red flags, and I go over all of them in the book. But particularly for younger kids, if they're fixated on mass killers, fascinated with Hitler, collecting information, the Sandy Hook killer actually, after the tragedy, there was a 7 foot long by 4 foot long spreadsheet that he had made listing every other mass murder in history in 9-point font with every detail about the crime. And he had spent years studying other mass killers. And so this is one of the things that is another red flag. If somebody is writing stories about Hitler or other mass killers, obviously sometimes it doesn't carry any significant meaning, but it's a really good reason to consult a therapist, to get in touch with someone with forensic experience, or if it's someone not that you don't know, get in touch with law enforcement, because so many events, we don't even have data on how many of these events are interrupted, but many are interrupted because somebody did see something and somebody did say something, or someone reached out to law enforcement and someone got help. And so that's my main concern.
FBI tip line. Here it is. 1-800 call FBI, or 1-800-225-5324 for their major case contact center. Is that the one?
Yeah. But certainly, if you're a student at a university and you hear someone making threats, there have been a lot of university shootings. Go to your local university, let them know, as well as the FBI. And so to make reports as many places as possible, because things do fall through the cracks. And there are thousands and thousands of reports made to the FBI every day. So it's just important to report to as many places as possible, to get intervention as soon as possible. If a kid is showing fixation on violence, on killing, talking about mass killers, or collecting information on them, um, get intervention early and get help, and take all of it seriously. The mind of mass killers, it's important that we understand, because if we understand, we can see that what's horrifying is not necessarily incomprehensible. It does make sense. And in order to interrupt it, we have to understand it, and we have to see the red flags, and we have to know what to do.
And it is working. I mean, I think they've already thwarted a few possible mass
We have
killings in the
thwarted
last year.
many have been thwarted. Yeah, the FBI is busy. And as I say, things do fall through the cracks sometimes, but that's why we make multiple reports, and we report in as many places as possible. It really is important.
Well, I really appreciate it, Shavaun Scot, for being part of it. The name of your book again, and when do you think it'll be coming out?
The Minds of Mass Killers, Understanding and Interrupting the Pathway to Violence, and it will be released in the fall of 2021 by McFarland Books, available wherever books are sold.
Thank you. So that's another episode of All Things 3. Actually, just a little special thing, an interview with Shavaun Scot, and thank you.